The presentation is divided into two parts, and the first looks back to a recording session undertaken by the choir in St Mary's in December 1975, arising from which we issued the LP record entitled Music from St Mary's. It featured solo organ music on the Marcusson organ on one side, played by myself, and choral works on the other, accompanied by now Professor David Baker. In addition to the LP programme, a further repertoire of choral items was recorded at the same time, so as to give us plenty of flexibility in making our final choice for the LP. This evening, we hear just 5 items from that project. The second part of the presentation features a further 5 items from one of several tapes made on my Revox of live performances abroad. That of a concert at St Catherine's Church, Ribe, given on Tuesday, 29th of July, 1980, has digitalised well. Now, at this point, I should just clarify the story behind these tapes. They were disinterred from storage just 2 or 3 years ago and were found to be in very variable condition. The way forward was to bake each tape in an oven to fix the contents. I've never heard of that before. Then we had to transcribe the results onto CD. Then followed many hours of listening, discussing, should I say, and decision making. The mastermind behind all this was Jeremy Tribick, a name familiar to some of you. He's a former St Mary's chorister who joined the choir in 1970 at the age of 6, and who still sings with me to this day as a very fine bass. So a big thank you to Jeremy. I felt very strongly motivated to resurrect these performances and to have them digitally captured into an accessible form, both as an archival record and hopefully also as an enjoyable listening experience. I see this project very much as a tribute to the magnificent effort of the boys, the men, and notably the boys' parents, who came back relentlessly and reliably, time and again, through all weathers, through thick and thin, to be with their fellow team members. They sang 3 fully choral services a week. Apart from warm-ups before each service, they had only 1 weekly rehearsal night, and they were unpaid. They got a bit of pocket money, some of them, but they were unpaid effectively. Choir boys went on to be choir men or occasionally servers. No less than 4 different church treasurers were all either choir members or choir dads during my time, as were a priest and a lay reader. In many ways, they were the lifeblood of the church. What you will hear will not be a fully funded, fully professional cathedral choir operating on 2 rehearsals a day, but a collection of ordinary good people doing extraordinary things. And for this, as well as for their music, I salute them. Indeed, I salute those of you who are with us tonight, and there are quite a few of you, to my delight. Later this year, it's hoped that a set of probably 3 CDs will be released. In case you'd like to be kept in touch with progress on that front, without, of course, any obligation, please have pen and paper ready and drop a line to Jeremy on the email address, which will appear at a couple of points during the course of the presentation. After part 1, there'll be an opportunity for questions and polite comments under the ever watchful control of our resident magician, Ian Watts. And there'll be a further similar opportunity at the end. Ian, I think we could start with 1 or 2 pictures now, please. Well, here's the face of the original LP sleeve, featuring this lovely Dearden engraving after an original drawing by one J.A. Hammersley. Thanks, Ian. And here is what our continental brethren charmingly refer to as the backside, which routinely gives all the basic details. I must just say, I'm sorry the scans are rather blurred. Blame me totally for that. I don't know why they are, but that's how they've come out. Thanks, Ian. Let's go on to a clearer picture. Now then, sadly, I wasn't very archive conscious in those days, and very few photographs of any relevance survive. One or two we have, however, do come fairly near to the mark, surprisingly so, when you think that all choirs, and most of all the boys' choir, inevitably has a constantly shifting membership. You will see me in the middle there with a wig on. This rare formal picture was indeed taken outside the vestry at St Mary's, and we can pin this down to sometime in 1976, just a few months after the recording. If you'll check out the middle row, at the very left-hand end is none other than our Jeremy, whom I mentioned a little earlier in connection with all the technical work on the old tapes. Thanks, Ian. I'm fairly certain that this picture would have been taken at what the Germans call a Rastplatz during a coach stop, possibly in Germany, I think, in 1976 again. As you'll see, it features a group of our songmen, as I like to call them. Standing up is now Dr. Alec Roth, a prolific composer whose anthem, Sol Justitiae, was the feature work at a hugely enjoyable RSCM Come and Sing Day, led by Lindsay Gray at Carcolston in 2019. Alec is one of those frustrating people who are good at everything. He's a world authority on Javanese gamelan music. He's a fine organist and singer, and amongst other talents, he's a proficient cartoonist, having accepted any number of commissions, for example, from Punch. He also drew a set of cartoons of St Mary's Choir, including one of me, for some unknown reason, wielding a whip. At the right is the now Reverend Canon Peter McGeary, and Peter's joined us this evening. He's the vicar of All Saints, the church in the rather notorious Cable Street, a place well known before the war for the Oswald Mosley riots. And he's also a canon of Westminster Abbey. Next to him is Michael Clifford, who started with us as an 8-year-old choir boy, and who by this time was a fine young bass, a typical story of front row to back row. Michael's since been awarded an MBE for services to the local community. Lounging on the bench with fashionable shades is Lindsay Gray, whom some of you will know as former headmaster of Llandaff Cathedral Choir School and former director of the RSCM, and who was also guest of honour at our annual luncheon last February. Thanks, Ian. Now, in a moment, you'll find here's the email address I mentioned at the beginning to help you to keep in touch with developments, if you would like. And now to the music. First off, we'll hear the Marcusson organ in Buxtehude's Prelude and Fugue in F. Neil, who's watching, I rather think you learnt this with me on our little GDB organ. If you want a starter intro into Buxtehude's bigger works, this I think is possibly the best place to begin. Buxtehude is generally considered the foremost of Bach's predecessors, though I suspect our honorary secretary may beg to differ with me on that. Although he operated most famously in Lübeck, Buxtehude would be more than my life's worth not to clarify that he was actually Danish. Thanks, Ian. Now, our first choral piece is by Henry Purcell, Remember Not, Lord, Our Offences. Purcell undoubtedly remains to this day one of England's greats. He was born in 1659 and at the grand old age of 20 was appointed organist of Westminster Abbey, displacing his own teacher, John Blow. Ironically, Blow was subsequently to regain his position upon Purcell's tragically early death in 1695, which he in turn retained until his own death in 1708. This is a rather demanding work in 6 parts, SSAATB, and is notable for its many harmonic twists and turns, the individual parts constantly having to negotiate strange things like minor sevenths, diminished fifths, and so on. It's a piece which I think eschews equal temperament, for those of us who are interested in that sort of thing. And it really cannot be accompanied on a modern keyboard instrument, nor, for that matter, any keyboard. I think the trick with this piece is to let the singers find their own temperament through the music itself, and trust them all to come out at the same place at the end, which I'm pleased to say they do. During this performance, we've incorporated the middle 2 pages of the score on the video, which, if you have a look at it, you'll see that point is quite well illustrated in any of the parts, in fact. Thanks, Ian. Well, it's not often that a musician finds his way onto a British postage stamp. So there we are, and I'm sure Douglas already has a copy of that stamp, as indeed I do. Now then, Orlando Gibbons, one of the mighty Tudors. If anything, I would venture to suggest, if I dare, that he could be considered the best of the lot. His 8-part "Oh Clap Your Hands Together," for example, is absolutely magnificent and was a particular favourite of the choir. Here we have his 6-part Hosanna to the Son of David, a work which alternates first sections of 5 soloists, S, S, A, T, with the full choir. Our 2 star trebles in the verse parts are John Harrison, who is the youngest brother of our immediate past President Roger, and David Richmond. The altos are Lindsay Gray and myself, and the tenor, who begins the piece solo, is indeed our very own Roger. Thank you, Ian. I have to say, I think that works quite outstanding for its lovely bounce and its joie de vivre, and indeed its sense of, if you like, motu perpetuo. Boyce. William Boyce is possibly most famous in church music circles for his collection of Boyce's cathedral music, first published in 3 volumes around 1760 to 1762. Apart from anything else, and most importantly, this is the first ever collection to have been published in full score, as opposed to individual parts, and thus it was really groundbreaking. I recall not infrequently ogling a set of these volumes, housed in the vestry at St John's College, Cambridge, firmly locked behind wire-fronted cupboard doors. Apart from its intrinsic beauty, I came to appreciate this particular piece as a splendid teaching tool for the boys, with its modest tempo, its simple crotchets, minims, and dotted crotchets, and its melodic movements, often just by step alone, with the occasional fourth or fifth, all easily and, importantly, rewardingly assimilated by a child just setting out on the path to that magical world of musical notation. This is also the first occasion we hear, albeit in the background, our wonderful accompanist, now Professor David Baker. Thank you, Ian. May I just at this point offer a special greeting we have two visitors from abroad. We have Tim Harrison, a very, very fine member of the choir for years, from New York, and Richard Howarth from Nova Scotia, who joined me in a later choir as tenor. In fact, the whole family sang in the choir at Clifton. It's lovely to see that you're both with us tonight, and thank you for taking the trouble. Now then, moving on into the 19th century, here's our one and only Samuel Sebastian Wesley. One would hardly know where to start with all the stories, many of them contradictory, about this famous character in 19th century English church music. Suffice it to say that his music appealed at the time, and since it's never been really out of fashion. Even such a little ditty as Lead Me, Lord, has its place in the hearts of many. I well recall a Mr. Morgan, headmaster of Hayden Road Junior School in Sherwood, who unfailingly commenced every daily assembly by playing a recording of this little anthem to his children. Imagine that happening now. Towards the other end of the scale, copies of Blessed Be the God and Father are to be found in many choir libraries, at least those which haven't yet been turfed out by progressive clergy. And more than likely, those copies bound down the spine with brown butterfly tape and priced at a penny halfpenny. It's recorded that this piece was first composed for Wesley's Hereford choir during a flu epidemic, when the choir was down to 6 boys and 1 bass, who was also the dean's butler. Wesley recomposed the work more than once to give us our current version, but it's easy to discern its origin with its unison, if you like, quasi-recitative men's passages and the extended treble solo sections. In this performance, the solo boy is John Harrison, whom you heard in the Gibbons, and who only a few months later was singing bass. In the formal photograph you saw earlier, and we'll see again shortly, you can see John, if you can remember this, in the back row, 6th from the left, 6th from the left. Thank you, Dennis. Ian, sorry. Thank you, Ian. Is it question time?
I believe it is, yes, please.
Jolly good.
Can I start the questioning?
Oh, yes, please do,
If I can
Ian.
start the interrogation off then, please.
Yes.
I run choirs myself. How do you manage to keep that quality level? Was it an auditioned choir or was it by invite? How did you manage that particular aspect, please?
As far as the boys were concerned, it was by audition. And then, and particularly now, I've no doubt, the only way really to run a choir like that is to, in terms of recruiting, is to try everything in your armory. You don't just recruit in one particular way, like writing letters to the paper or visiting schools. You do everything you can. My main source of recruitment, I suppose, was schools. I visited them quite heavily and had very, very good cooperation from most head teachers, apart perhaps from one who was very reluctant to help, and I discovered afterwards was an elder of the local Methodist church. So I suspect that might have had something to do with it. No names, no patrol. As far as the gentlemen are concerned, well, there were always about, I should think 50% of the gents were always ex-choristers. So they were, by definition, more than good for the job, as it were. And they were absolutely wonderful, generation after generation. Anybody applying from outside would certainly have to be auditioned first. I did once admit an extremely nice bass, God rest his soul, and I really, he'd been lost to a choir which had been disbanded by its vicar, not so far away from St Mary's, and I felt sorry for him, and I admitted him on the strength of that rather than of his singing and music reading. And in all honesty, it was a problem for me from that day onwards. I coped with it, but it wasn't easy. You do need to audition people up to a point. And I can tell you many funny stories about auditions. I remember auditioning one boy whose father was a very eminent surgeon. And we were in the middle of this audition at his home in Woollerton. And suddenly a little white mouse popped out of his jacket pocket. He'd taken it in to keep him company. I think was rather nice. Yes, occasionally boys would apply to the choir. They'd perhaps move in from another area. That was obviously a small but useful source of recruitment. But I think most boys really came in through the schools. I'm just looking at the screen here. I'm looking at Glyn. Glyn was attracted to the choir by, I think, a notice on the notice board at school, weren't you, Glyn? We've got, can I see Roger there? Yes, I can see Roger. Roger was a bit of a one-off. Roger was my very first organ pupil in Nottingham. And if anything, Roger was more focused on bell ringing at Beeston. But I noticed from his speaking voice that he might be rather useful tenor. So I invited him, I think, to apply, and he did. Of course, he walked straight in. Now I can also see Neil Richardby there. Neil is the one with the magnificent white beard. You might be able to spot him. Neil is in fact Glyn's brother, and he would also have joined through similar circumstances. In fact, those two joined before I took over the choir. They were indeed, they were informed of the choir through school by my predecessor. And I can see Mike there. I'm just trying to think of exactly how Michael joined. He was actually already in the choir at St Faith's Wilford, no, St Wilfrid's Wilford, I think. And the family got wind of St Mary's choir and applied, and to the rather somewhat displeasure of the organist of St Wilfrid's Wilford, decided to start, oh, there he is, decided to start doing something about his singing. And there were a couple of wonderful brothers, Andrew, who's slightly older, who I thought would be with us tonight, but I can't see him as yet. Yes, I don't know if have I answered your question, Ian?
Yes, you have. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Can I invite others to ask a question? If you want to wave your hands around, and I will invite you to unmute. Anybody got a question for David? Let's go to President David Hanford first, please. To unmute yourself, please, David.
David, on the vexed question of how to deal with trebles voices breaking, what was your view at that time? Did you keep them involved throughout that change, or give them a period off?
Yeah, my attitude was very much one of continuing. First of all, you need to be clear that a boy's voice will change in one of two main ways. It'll either change gradually or it'll suddenly snap. And that's what breaking really means. But changing is a better word to use. And the majority of boys, I think, changed rather than broke. The best thing is to keep singing, but not to expect enormous wafts of sound from a voice which has just changed. The voice should be treated relatively gently. There is an issue with boys, of course, is that once they get on the football pitch, they tend to shout their heads off, which is really the worst thing they can possibly do. And that was out of one's control. But basically, a voice would, quite a lot of the boys first went to alto and then possibly to tenor, and might stay there with if you're lucky enough, because tenors are always rather a rare breed. I'm sure Roger would agree with that. Otherwise, like John Harrison, for example, he popped straight down to bass, if I remember rightly. We saw James Hughes earlier on. He's there somewhere watching us. I can't see James at the moment. James was also in the choir at St Wilfrid's Wilford, and I think his voice did more or less break, but his choirmaster there insisted on keeping him on, almost pretending, I think, to sing treble, which was, to be honest, was very unkind. So I only knew James as a bass. I don't think he ever sang any of the middle parts. So, yeah, carry on, whatever happens, carry on somehow, even if it's just, I mean, if they've got an awful croaky voice, make them, well, we used to have a whole period, a whole series of jobs for the boys at St Mary's, one of which indeed was lavatory inspector. As long as they had some sort of job, that was the important thing at that stage. Mike's laughing. I suspect he must have had that job at one stage. And I remember John Harrison did as well. He used to make great fun of it.
And Richard Eaton, please.
Richard.
David, is the organ at St Mary's tuned to 440?
Yes, it is.
Ah, it sounded as if it might have been a bit sharper than that tonight, but that must just be I'm listening on very small speakers and just my ear at the moment. But I thought it was just worth asking.
Well, as we were singing in December, I'm surprised that it should be sharp. It say 440 at somewhere around 68 degrees Fahrenheit, which I think is 20 centigrade.
Yes.
So I doubt, knowing St Mary's as it is, I doubt very much if
it would be sharp. No. I
sharp.
just wondered if by some quirk, it had been tuned a little bit.
Oh no, we wouldn't do anything non-standard like that. The organ had to be, the organ had to be exceptional, but it also had to be as ordinary as it could be in certain ways. For example, the pitch, equal temperament, and so forth. But the temperature in St Mary's in the winter was something to be reckoned with. I remember when steam used to come out of the singers' mouths, and I had to conduct in gloves.
Thank you, Richard. Anybody else like to ask a question at this point? By the way, the people that don't have their video on, just the names on the screen, if you would like to ask a question at any time, you can put it in the chat and I'll see it there.
Yes, let's have a couple of 2 or 3 minutes comfort break. Thank you.